I have told this story exactly 3 times in my life. Once to a tribunal that didn't believe me. Once to a woman I loved who left before I finished. And now to you, because I am old and the colony records were sealed, and someone ought to know what happened out on Vega Seca before the commission scrubbed the settlement files and called it a geological event. There was nothing geological about it. My name is Jorge Carrasco. I was 41 years old when I went to Vega Seca. I had been an independent field investigator for 11 years by then, the kind of work nobody respects until they need it. Livestock deaths, contamination reports, missing persons filings that the colonial authorities chalk up to accidents on hostile terrain and move past without looking too closely. The sort of incidents that the colonial administration classifies as low priority and files in a drawer and forgets. Because frontier settlements are always losing animals and sometimes people, and the commission has learned that the less it investigates, the less it has to explain. I had spent a decade explaining things they didn't want explained. It was not a profession that made me popular with regional offices, but it was an honest one. And on the days when I found the thing that was actually happening underneath the thing that was officially happening, it was the only kind of work that felt like it mattered. Vega Seca was a mid-tier agricultural colony, 43,000 settlers on a semi-arid world that the terraforming surveys had rated B- for habitability, meaning it worked mostly. The rains came when they were supposed to, give or take a week. The soil took seed. The goats and the cattle and the modified sheep the colonists had brought from the transit ships fattened up reasonably well in the river valleys, thinner on the plateau but enough. It wasn't a paradise. The sun hit too hard in summer, and the winters turned the eastern plateau into a wind tunnel that froze pipes and cracked equipment housings, and made people mean in the bone-deep way that has nothing to do with character and everything to do with cold. But it was theirs. They had built it house by house and field by field over 22 years, and 43,000 people had staked their futures on that pale red dirt, and were, by and large, glad they had. I got the first report in September of that year. A rancher named Higuera out on the southern fringe had lost 11 goats in a single night. No predator tracks, no blood trail. The carcasses were found at dawn in the middle of the pasture, laid out almost neatly, the way you might set tools down on a workbench. Skin intact. No bite marks. No claw marks that anyone could find. Every one of them completely drained, not of blood specifically, but of fluid. All of it. They were dry inside the way a beef jerky strip is dry. The organs collapsed and papery. The muscle tissue desiccated to something that crumbled when the veterinary officer pressed it with a gloved finger. The local animal health officer filed a contamination report. Atmospheric anomaly, he wrote. Possible mineral interaction with the water supply affecting cellular osmosis at the tissue level. He didn't believe it either. You could tell by the way he used words he wasn't sure of, the way people write when they are trying to sound technical about something that has no technical explanation they are willing to commit to. I read it because I read everything. Every contamination report, every livestock anomaly filing, every missing persons addendum from every colonial settlement in the sectors I covered. I had a standing arrangement with a commission records clerk who forwarded anything flagged unusual, and I paid him in case liquor from whatever world I happened to be passing through, and we had maintained this arrangement for 7 years, and it had served us both well. I flagged the Higuera report and filed it, and went back to a boundary dispute on Kerrigan's world that was paying my rent. But I kept the Vega Seca item in the back of my head the way you keep a loose tooth, prodding it when I wasn't thinking about anything else, not sure if it was going to fall out clean or take the jaw with it. 6 weeks later there were 9 more ranches, 48 animals. 2 of them weren't animals. The 2 settlers were a father and his teenage son, found the same way as the goats, in the middle of their field, laid out with what I can only describe as care, which is the word that bothered me most when I read the preliminary report, because the person who wrote it clearly hadn't meant to write it and hadn't been able to find a different word that was accurate. The father's hat was on his head. The boy's boots were laced. They were dry and they were dead, and there was no forensic cause listed on the preliminary report, because the forensic officer on Vega Seca was a man named Delgado who had trained on Meridian Station, and had never in his career seen anything he couldn't categorize, and he was not prepared to write down what he was looking at. I had seen a lot of death in my career. Field investigation takes you to it regularly and without warning, and you either develop a way of holding it at arm's length while you do your work, or you find a different line of work. I had developed the arm's length approach. It is a necessary skill and it has costs, and I have paid some of those costs in the years since, in the form of things I do not let myself think about directly but that surface anyway, in the particular hours of the night when you have no defenses left. The boy's boots, laced. That was the detail I kept coming back to on the transit to Vega Seca, the one that wouldn't stay at arm's length. It was the detail that told me, not as a professional assessment, as something simpler and older than professionalism, that whatever had done this was not wild, not an animal following appetite. It had looked at a dead child and done something deliberate with him, and that deliberateness was a kind of intelligence, and that intelligence was not ours. I booked transit that same week. The shuttle from the way station to Vega Seca took 31 hours, and I spent most of it reading everything the public records had on the southern fringe settlements, their history, their infrastructure, their population distribution, the terrain between the outermost ranches and the main colony center. I wanted to understand the geography before I arrived, because geography tells you things that people won't say directly. It tells you where you are exposed and where you are not, and on Vega Seca the southern fringe was very exposed, a broad flat arc of ranch land running out toward a system of dry creek basins and rocky outcroppings that the survey maps marked as geologically inactive and essentially uninhabited. The colony's populated core was to the north. The fringe was the edge of what they had built, the part that pressed against the empty land, and it was the part where things were dying. Vega Seca's main settlement was called Carrasco, named after the first survey team commander, not the word, though by the time I arrived the coincidence felt pointed. It was a town of about 4,000 people. Wide main street of packed red earth, prefab administrative block with a commission seal that had been repainted 3 times and still looked faded. A bar that doubled as a community hall on market days and weekends. A medical clinic that also served as the commission liaison office, because there wasn't budget for both in the same town. The kind of town that knows everyone's business and discusses it loudly and expects outsiders to state their purpose at the door before they sit down. I stated mine to the duty officer, a man named Teniente Bravo, who was polite in the way that means he had already decided I wasn't useful. He was not a soldier, not a real law officer. He was a colonial administrator, a man who had spent 7 years managing permits and settling disputes about fence lines and water rights, and the occasional assault charge when the winters got long and 2 neighboring ranchers found they hated each other more than they had previously realized. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man operating at the edge of his competence and not yet willing to admit it, which is a condition I have seen in administrators on every settled world I have ever visited, and which I have learned to work around rather than argue with, because arguing with it accomplishes nothing and wastes time that is usually precious. He told me the deaths were under investigation. He told me the commission had been notified. He told me the settlers were understandably upset, but that spreading unverified theories in the community would not help the situation and could in fact make it considerably worse. I asked him what his verified theory was. He said they were looking at environmental factors and that an assessment team had been requested. Environmental factors. I have heard those 2 words on 6 worlds in 11 years, and they have never once meant anything except, we don't know and we're afraid to say we don't know, and we are hoping the situation resolves itself before someone with authority to demand an answer asks us directly. I thanked him for his time and went to the bar. There were 2 other people at the carry-on bar that first night who had come to Vega Seca for the same reason I had, arriving from different directions by different means, neither of them knowing about the other, until we all ended up at the same table in the same way that people who are looking for the same thing tend to find each other in unfamiliar places. One was a man named Duncan McGregor, a xenobiologist attached to a university on Harlan's World, who had come on his own funding, after seeing the Commission's contamination report forwarded through an academic alert network, and identifying something in the cellular collapse pattern that didn't match any known environmental mechanism. He was a tall man, narrow, with the kind of dry precision in his speech that scientists develop when they've spent a great many years presenting findings to committees that don't want to hear them. He had been in carry-on for 4 days before I arrived, and in that time had interviewed the veterinary officer, reviewed the autopsy reports on the 2 human victims, and visited 2 of the attack sites. He ordered water at the bar and read his notes and did not look up when I sat across from him, which I respected. A man who can be interrupted easily is usually a man whose thoughts aren't worth interrupting. I told him who I was and what I did. He looked up and told me who he was and what he had found, and we were on the same page inside of 10 minutes. The other person was a woman named Amanda, a journalist from the Frontier Press Collective, who had a source inside the Commission's regional office, and had gotten hold of the full autopsy reports, not the edited versions filed publicly, the full ones, and who had been on Vega Seca for 2 days, and had already managed to irritate Teniente Bravo sufficiently that he had lodged a complaint with her editor about the nature of her questions. She was not interested in being careful in the way that official channels preferred. She had the shape of a story already in her head, and she wanted the facts to fill the spaces, and I could see within the first half hour of talking to her that she was smart enough that the facts she found were not going to be allowed to simply confirm the shape she had started with. She would let them change the shape. That is rarer than it should be. We sat together for 3 hours that first night. Amanda had ordered the local beer, which was dark and flat, and tasted of whatever mineral the colony's water table ran through. McGregor eventually ordered some too. We pooled what we knew and laid it out on the table between us and looked at it, and none of us liked the shape of what we were looking at, but all 3 of us preferred the discomfort of knowing the shape to the comfort of not knowing it. McGregor spread his notes and his diagrams. The cellular collapse in the victims, human and animal both, was not osmotic. It was not caused by any external chemical interaction with the tissue, not any compound in the air or the water or the soil that could have entered the body through normal exposure routes and done this. The collapse originated from within, specifically from the vascular system, and spread outward to the tissues in a cascade pattern that took roughly 40 minutes from initiation to completion. Something had entered the bloodstream, he was not yet certain of the entry mechanism, and triggered a process that the tissue itself performed. Not poison, which kills cells directly, not disease, which corrupts them over time, something more like a signal. A biological instruction delivered to the body's own cellular machinery that told it to release its fluid content simultaneously, the way a plant wilts when its water pressure drops, but catastrophically fast and total and irreversible. He had a name for the mechanism. He called it forced lysis cascade. He had seen something analogous, not identical, analogous, and the distinction mattered in the xenobiology literature, specifically in a paper about a predator species catalogued on Drevos IV that used hollow chitinous spines to inject a compound directly into the vascular system of its prey. The compound didn't kill directly. It commandeered the prey's own cellular machinery and used it against the animal, the way a virus hijacks a cell's replication process. The prey's body did the work of its own dehydration, and the predator waited. He had brought the Drevos IV paper with him in its complete form, unredacted, because he had been a peer reviewer on it 7 years ago and kept a copy. Amanda asked if he was saying what she thought he was saying. He said he was saying the deaths on Vega Seca were consistent with predation by a non-catalogued xenobiological organism, using a methodology of prey processing not previously observed in this sector, and possibly not observed anywhere in a settled context. I asked how large the predator would need to be. He didn't know. The carcasses didn't give him a useful size reference because there was no physical damage to measure, no bite radius to estimate jaw size from, no claw span to work backward from. It hadn't torn its way in. It had inserted something, probably multiple somethings simultaneously, too fine to leave a visible wound channel in tissue that had already desiccated completely by the time anyone examined it. Amanda said it drank them. McGregor said that was a simplification, but not an inaccurate one. We sat with that for a while. The bar was still half full around us, colonists talking, the volume lower than it probably usually was, the kind of quiet that settles over a community that is scared and doesn't want to admit it in public, that hasn't yet decided what it is going to do with the fear. I watched them. These were people who had crossed light years to build something. Farmers and mechanics and teachers and medics and children who had never known any other sky. They had come here because out here there was land and possibility, and a life that was their own, and something was killing their animals and killing them, and the administration was talking about environmental factors. I have thought about that bar many times in the years since. The smell of the local beer and the dust that came in under the door when someone opened it, and the way the lamplight made everyone's face look a little older than they were. I have thought about the rancher at the corner table who had lost his wife the previous spring to a cardiac event and was now raising 2 daughters alone, and who would be dead inside of 2 weeks. I did not know that then. I just saw a tired man having a beer, turning a glass in his hands and not talking to anyone, the way men do when they are thinking about something they cannot resolve by thinking. We met again the following morning, and McGregor laid out what he wanted to do, which was go to the attack sites and take samples himself rather than rely on what the veterinary officer had collected, because the veterinary officer had not been looking for what McGregor was looking for and had not known to preserve certain elements. I told him I would come. Amanda came without being invited, and I stopped protesting after about 5 minutes because she had a better off-road vehicle than mine, and she could drive it faster on the fringe roads without either of us dying. The Higuera Ranch was the original site, 6 weeks old by then, and what remained of it as an evidence scene was minimal. The perimeter marker the animal health officer had placed and never removed, some discoloration in the soil at the points where the carcasses had been found, the general emptiness of a pasture that was supposed to have animals in it. The rancher himself met us at the gate. He was a compact man with the weathered skin of someone who works outside every day of his life and the eyes of someone who has not been sleeping. He looked at my credentials and McGregor's university identification and didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "You're not from the commission, then?" I said no. He said, "Good," and opened the gate. McGregor took samples, soil cores from where each carcass had been found, air swabs, grass cuttings. He worked methodically and did not hurry, and I let him work while I walked the field the way I had learned to walk evidence fields over 11 years, not looking for what was there but looking for what was missing, what the ground should show and didn't. Tracks. Pressure marks in the soil that would indicate weight and movement. The disturbed grass patterns that any large organism moving across a field at night would leave behind. There was nothing. The field was undisturbed except at the exact points where the bodies had lain, and at those points the disturbance was minimal, the impression of weight on the grass, the soil staining from the fluid released during the cascade, nothing else. Whatever had come across that field had done it in a way that left no trace of its passage. That is not an easy thing to do. Most animals cannot do it. It requires either very little mass distributed across a large surface area, or a very precise and controlled method of locomotion that minimizes ground contact, or both. Amanda found the marks. She was working the edge of the field, 40 meters from the nearest carcass location, where the soil gave way to a low, rocky outcropping that rose about 12 meters above the pasture level. She called us over without raising her voice, which told me she had understood by then that calling out across open ground was not something we should be doing casually. When we reached her, she pointed at the rock face. There were marks in it. Long, shallow grooves, very regular in their spacing, approximately 8 centimeters between parallel grooves, 4 grooves per set, and they ran vertically down the face of the outcropping rather than horizontally. Not the horizontal drag marks of an animal climbing with claws. The impression of something pressed against the rock with significant force while moving downward. Like something that had climbed down from the top of that outcropping, and done it with the grip pressure of a hand on a railing. If the hand had 4 fingers spaced 8 centimeters apart and pressed hard enough to leave shallow grooves in rock. I looked up. The top of the outcropping was clear against the morning sky, nothing there. The sky above was pale and empty. McGregor measured the groove spacing with a tool from his kit. He was very quiet for a long time. He measured twice. He took photographs from several angles. He looked at the photographs on his scanner screen, and then looked back at the rock face, and then looked at his notes, and then he sat down on a flat piece of rock at the base of the outcropping, and was quiet for another long time. He said, the Drevos IV specimen had a limb structure adapted for vertical surfaces, adhesive pads, chitinous, left groove marks in rock when moving at speed. The groove spacing in the paper was measured at between 7 and 9 centimeters, varying by individual. He said, the Drevos IV specimen on record was roughly the size of a large dog. He said, xenobiology operates on a fundamental assumption, based on every documented case in the catalog, that lone specimens are almost never lone specimens. A lone specimen is a dispersed individual from a larger group. The lone specimen is not the threat. The group is the threat. We drove back to carry on in silence. Amanda drove and did not ask questions, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. There are times when questions are what you need and times when you need to sit with what you know for a while before you can talk about it, and she understood the difference. That afternoon, I went to see Tenient Bravo again, and I put McGregor's preliminary findings on his desk, written up as cleanly and directly as McGregor could manage, and I told him what we had found at the Higuera Ranch. I told him he needed to contact the Commission's Regional Security Office and request a response team, not an environmental assessment team, a security team, armed and equipped, because there were organisms actively operating in the southern fringe that were predating on settlers and their livestock, and the mechanism was xenobiological in origin, and the situation was going to get worse. And it was going to get worse in a way that an environmental assessment team arriving in 3 to 4 weeks was not going to be useful for. He read the findings. He took his time reading them. I watched his face while he read, not to judge him, but because faces tell you where a conversation is going before the words start. His face went through several things. Uncertainty first, then something that might have been fear, briefly. Then the particular expression of a man who has found a category to put something into that makes it manageable, even if the category is not quite right. He told me the findings were speculative. He told me I was not a licensed xenobiologist, and therefore my co-interpretation of a licensed xenobiologist's preliminary notes carried no official standing in an administrative proceeding. He told me that publishing or distributing alarming theories to the colonist population without verification through proper channels could create a panic that would be more dangerous than whatever wildlife situation was actually occurring. He told me he would forward my concerns to the regional office through appropriate channels, and that I should allow the process to work. He also mentioned, as I was leaving, that Amanda's press credentials were under review at the regional licensing office, and that she should be cautious about filing material that could be characterized as inflammatory. I stood on the main street of Carrasco in the afternoon heat after I left his office, and I made a decision that I had made before in different forms on different worlds. It never gets easier. The decision was this. The administration was not going to move in time, and if I waited for the administration, I was going to watch more people die in their fields while paperwork moved through channels, and that was not something I was willing to do. If there were going to be consequences for what I did next, I would deal with them afterward, when there was an afterward to deal with them in. I went to find Ramon Hurtado. I had heard his name 2 days before I arrived on Vega Seca, from a contact on the Colonial Information Network who described him as the person who knew the southern fringe better than anyone living, a man who had been running livestock across that terrain for 15 years through every season and condition the land offered, and who had been out on the fringe every night for the past 2 weeks, sleeping 4 hours and riding the rest, looking for whatever was killing his neighbor's animals and his neighbors. Because nobody in an official capacity seemed to be doing it, and the thing needed doing. He was in the bar when I found him, not drinking, sitting with a mug of something hot and his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing. He was compact and weathered in the specific way of men who spend their lives working in conditions that don't forgive carelessness, and he had the eyes of someone who has spent a great deal of time watching horizons for things that don't belong, and has learned to trust what his eyes tell him, even when the official version says something different. He listened to everything I told him, McGregor's findings, the rock face marks, Bravo's response, what I thought was in that Southern Creek Basin, without interrupting once. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had found something 3 days ago that he had not reported to Bravo because he had stopped believing Bravo was going to do anything useful with information. He took us out the following morning before first light. The location was 15 kilometers south of the most recent attack site, in a dry creek basin that the colony used as a seasonal water channel in flood years. The creek bed was wide and flat, and in the pre-dawn gray it looked like nothing, just more of the pale red rock that covered the southern fringe for as far as you could see in most directions. Then the light came up. There was a depression in the center of the creek bed, roughly circular, 20 meters across at the surface, pressed into the ground the way you press a thumb into clay when the clay is still wet. No explosive scatter pattern, no fragmentation, no material displaced outward the way a meteor strike displaces material. Just a clean, steep-walled bowl, settling into the earth as if something very heavy had come down onto it with absolute controlled force, and stayed there until the rock beneath it had yielded. Around the rim, the rock was glazed. I have worked sites on enough worlds to know what rock looks like when it has been exposed to sustained high heat from below, and that was what this looked like. Fused at the surface, the texture changed from the granular red-brown of the surrounding creek bed to something smoother and darker, almost reflective in places. McGregor walked the perimeter for 40 minutes with his instruments under his coat, so the readings didn't look like readings to anyone watching from a distance. I watched him work. He has a particular way of moving when he is assembling a picture from data points, very deliberate, stopping at intervals, looking at the scanner and then at the physical thing he has scanned, as if he is checking that the two match. When he is satisfied that they match, he moves on. When they don't match, he stops and takes a longer look. He stopped several times at the glazed rim. When he finished, he sat down on a rock at the edge of the creek bed and looked at the depression for a while longer, and then he told us what he had. The depression was approximately 18 meters in diameter at the surface. Based on the deformation angle of the walls, the slope and depth relationship of the bowl, the actual cavity extended between 12 and 15 meters below grade. The glazing pattern on the rim was consistent with sustained thermal emission from a source inside the depression, not from an external strike. The heat had come from below, from inside, and it had been continuous rather than instantaneous. He said it looked like a landing site. He said, something came down into that creek bed, something that was generating significant heat as it decelerated, and it came down slowly and deliberately, and it went below grade. And based on the thermal readings he was still getting from the depression, whatever was generating that heat was still down there. Amanda had her recorder running. I made a decision not to stop her. Hurtado said the depression had not been there in June. He had ridden through this creek bed during a livestock count in the second week of June, and the bed had been flat and unbroken. Whatever had come down had done so sometime between June and September. 3 months. It had been underground for 3 months while the commission filed environmental reports and the regional office processed assessment requests and Tenient Bravo managed his fence disputes. 3 months, and whatever was inside it had been coming out. I will describe the next 2 weeks plainly, and without the construction of false certainty that comes when you write about terrible things after they are over, and your mind tries to impose a shape that wasn't there while you were living through them. The truth is that we were improvising. The truth is that I did not know if any of it was going to work, and that there were nights when I was quite sure it was not going to work, and that more people were going to die because I had not been fast enough or smart enough or persuasive enough to stop the right thing from happening at the right time. Bravo forwarded my report. The regional office responded in 6 days. 6 days during which there were 3 more deaths and then 4 more, each time the same, settlers found in their fields or on the paths between their fields and their homes, arranged, drained, the impossible stillness of something that had been alive and was now dry. 6 days in which McGregor worked 18 hours out of every 24 in his rented room with the sample equipment he had brought and the databases he could access remotely, building a picture one data point at a time. The regional office's response was, additional documentation requested. An environmental assessment team was scheduled for dispatch in 3 to 4 weeks, pending availability of qualified personnel. In the interim, colonists should exercise caution when moving between structures after dark and should report additional animal deaths through the established channels. 3 to 4 weeks. I read the response and I did not let myself feel what I felt about it, because feeling it wasn't going to be useful. What was going to be useful was what Hurtado had already started doing without waiting for anyone's authorization. He had organized them quietly. 31 colonists from the southern fringe ranches, men and women who had watched the official response fail and had stopped waiting for it to succeed. They were spending their nights in armed watches, pairs on each property, 2-hour rotations, staying inside the structures and watching through the windows rather than walking patrol, because Hurtado had correctly intuited that moving in the open at night was not a good idea. They were exhausted. They were frightened. They were doing it anyway. I talked to McGregor about what he had built from his samples and data. He told me about the sensory apparatus. They didn't navigate by visible light. Their primary sensory clusters, based on the physiology of the Drevo's IV specimen extrapolated to a larger body mass, were oriented toward thermal detection. They hunted by the heat signatures of living bodies. A human being was, to them, a warm shape against a cool background, impossible to miss in the dark. A machine, a vehicle, a building, not a target, invisible, generating no signal worth their attention unless a warm body was operating it in close proximity. He told me about the intelligence, not human intelligence, not anything that used tools or communicated in the ways we recognize, but the attack progression, always moving north, always increasing in range from the landing site as they expanded their scouting territory, always varying the timing of strikes so that no predictable pattern could be established, was not the behavior of an animal operating on instinct. Instinct is efficient and therefore consistent. This was variable and deliberate and responsive to the environment in ways that suggested something more than instinct, assessment, methodology. He used the word scouting. He said they were evaluating the settlement's size, distribution, population density, and response capability. They were determining what they had arrived on and whether it could be claimed. I asked him what claiming looked like, in his professional estimation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't know with certainty, because the Drevo's IV encounter had been a lone specimen encountered by a survey team that had not survived the encounter, and the data came from a probe drone that had recorded the aftermath, and not the event itself. He said that in terrestrial predator ecology, which was the closest analogy he had, inadequate as it was, when a pack completed its assessment of a new territory and judged it viable and undefended, it moved to claim it completely. Displacement or elimination of competing apex species. Establishment of feeding grounds. He said the systematic northern progression of the attacks suggested they had not yet reached a point they judged sufficient for a concentrated push, but that the expansion rate was increasing, and his estimate for when they would was within the week. Within the week, we had nothing from the commission, and nothing coming in time, and 31 colonists on 4-hour sleep rotations, watching through their windows in the dark. We had to work with what we had. What we had: McGregor's thermal scanner, borrowed from the Colonial Geology Survey on a form that didn't quite cover this use of it. McGregor's knowledge of their sensory apparatus, which told us that thermal invisible things were safe to move without being targeted. 4 of the colony's agricultural irrigation rigs, mobile pump units on wheel frames, designed to push water at high pressure through flexible hoses across distances up to 200 meters, used in the dry season to move water from storage tanks to fields that the rainfall couldn't reach. And the colony's emergency fuel reserve, which Tenient Bravo had not touched because he was still managing this situation. Administratively, and emergency fuel reserves are a metric of administrative preparedness that he did not want to be seen depleting without cause. The reserve was stored in 2 tanks at the east edge of the colony. Hurtado signed the requisition for it himself, not because he had the authority to do so in any technical sense, but because he had decided authority was something that got sorted out after you were alive to sort it out. He told me later that he had also called Bravo directly and told him what he was doing, so that Bravo could not later claim ignorance. Bravo had told him to stop. Hurtado had said he understood that Bravo had concerns, and that he was going to proceed regardless. McGregor and I modified the pump heads over 2 nights, working in the garage behind Hurtado's property. The modification was not complicated. The pump heads were designed to push fluid at high pressure through a hose to an outlet fitting. We changed what fluid they were pushing and what fitting was on the end. We worked by the light of a single lamp and didn't talk much. There is a particular kind of concentration that comes when you are working on something that has to be right, because the cost of it being wrong is people you know dying, and that concentration doesn't leave room for conversation. Amanda wrote everything down the whole time. She sat in the corner of the garage on an equipment crate with her recorder and her notebook, and she documented it all. And I found that I didn't mind, because if this worked, the documentation was going to be important, and if it didn't, the documentation would be all that was left. We needed to know when they were all inside the shelter. That was the central requirement, the one on which everything else depended. The plan was useless if even 2 or 3 of them were outside when we started, because outside meant mobile and thermal visible meant we were targets. It meant someone had to watch the depression at night from close range. The thermal scanner worked at 150 meters. To be reliable, McGregor wanted it within 120. 120 meters from the rim of that depression, in the dark, lying on cold rock under a survival blanket that cut thermal signature by about 60%, which was not 0, watching heat signatures go into the ground and counting until they stopped coming out. I did it myself on 2 consecutive nights. I'm not going to describe those nights in detail. I will say that the survival blanket worked well enough, and that the scanner was quiet, and that the things I watched move across the open creek bed in the dark before descending into the depression were not what I had imagined from McGregor's descriptions, though his descriptions had been accurate. Seeing a thing is different from understanding a thing. The way they moved was the worst part. Not because it was violent, but because it was unhurried. Patient in the way that something is patient when it does not yet understand that there is anything to be in a hurry about. I had been told, by a psychologist who evaluated me after a difficult assignment on Pelletier Station, that I have a high tolerance for physical discomfort and a low tolerance for the feeling of being powerless. She meant it as a neutral observation about my professional profile, but I think she intended it as a warning. What she meant, I think, was that I am capable of lying still for a very long time in a cold and dangerous place, as long as I am lying still on purpose, as long as the stillness is a choice I am making in service of something. What I cannot do is wait for other people to move when other people are not moving. Those 2 nights in the creek bed were the longest of my life precisely because I was choosing to be still, and because the choice was the right one, and because it cost me considerably more than I let on to anyone, then or since. On the first night I counted 9 going in and tracked them until the scanner registered no surface activity. On the second night I counted 11. McGregor's estimate was 8 to 14 individuals. 11 was not certainty, but 11 signatures underground and no surface activity before dawn on 2 consecutive nights was a pattern. These things had a shelter and they returned to it before daylight and they stayed there through the day, and that was the window. I went back to carry on before dawn on the second night, and I told Hurtado we were going that evening. We moved out at full dark. 31 colonists, 4 irrigation rigs, 400 liters of fuel, 400 meters of flexible hose, and whatever McGregor and I had been able to put together. No lights, no engines, the rigs on their wheel frames pushed by hand. The quiet that 30 people maintain when they have decided what they are doing and have nothing left to say about it is a particular kind of quiet. It is not tense. It is settled. These people had been frightened for weeks, and now they were done with the fear, not because the fear had resolved, but because they had moved through it and come out the other side into something colder and more useful. I have heard people describe courage as the absence of fear. That is not what I saw that night. What I saw was people who were afraid, and who had decided that the fear was not the governing consideration. There is a word for that, I think, but I have never been satisfied with any of the words people use for it. So I will just say what I saw. 31 people pushing heavy equipment in the dark in silence towards something that had been killing their neighbors, and none of them turning back. McGregor walked ahead of the column with the scanner under his coat. He checked the readings at intervals and signaled back with a hand motion we had agreed on. The signal was still clear. We moved for 2 hours, slow and steady, covering the 15 kilometers by a route Hurtado had chosen that kept us in the terrain shadow of the outcroppings as much as possible and off the open flat ground. We reached the creek basin edge an hour before what McGregor estimated was their typical return time, based on the 2-night observation pattern. We positioned the rigs around the depression rim, east and west and north and south, staying low on the approach so that we cleared the rim's edge only when we needed to insert the hose tips. McGregor swept the scanner in a full arc, nothing on the surface. He swept again. 11 signatures below, the same distribution as the night before. 11, not 12, not 14. 11, but they were in there and we were here and the window was now. I looked at Hurtado, he nodded. We inserted the hose tips over the rim edge and lowered them down. The depression walls were smooth and steep, and the hoses went down easily, the flexible couplings navigating the curve of the walls, the tips dropping into the darkness below. 4 hoses, positioned 90 degrees apart around the rim, running from the 4 rigs to the 4 insertion points. We pumped for 6 minutes. I won't spend time on the sounds from below. I'll say that they were not anything I had heard before and that they were not quiet, and that McGregor's hand was on my arm as they started and he said, very quietly, in my ear, "The compound suppresses the fight response in prey, makes them passive. They've never needed to know what to do about something that doesn't become passive." We detonated the charge at the 6-minute mark. The depression contained the explosion almost entirely. The overpressure went down and not out, which was what the geometry of the shaft predicted and what I had been counting on. The surface cracked and buckled in a ring around the rim, the ground heaving upward and then settling, the rock fracturing along the glazed fault lines the heat had already created, and the column of fire that came up was narrow and fast and then was gone, drawing back down into the shaft the way a breath is drawn back in. One of them came out. It came up through the fractured section of the east rim, where the blast had opened the rock enough for passage, and it moved in a way that I was not prepared for, even having watched them for 2 nights through a scanner. The scanner gives you heat signatures and movement vectors and nothing else. It does not give you the reality of the thing moving, the way the limbs articulated in a sequence that should not have worked on broken rock at that speed, the way it covered ground without what I would call running, just closed distance in a way that the eye had trouble tracking, because it didn't move the way things are supposed to move. It covered 10 meters before Hurtado put 2 rounds into it from his rifle, a weapon he had built himself from salvage components over several years into something that was accurate and powerful and entirely unregistered with the colonial authority, which in this context was the least of anyone's concerns. It changed direction after the first 2 rounds and he put 2 more into it, and it stopped. It lay in the creek bed at the edge of the fire's light from the shaft, and I walked to within 5 meters of it because I needed to see it clearly, and I needed to remember what I was looking at. And I have kept that memory for 20 years, and I am going to keep it until I don't have memories anymore. I won't describe it in specific detail, because the details are not the point, and because I am not interested in making you afraid of something that is already dead. What I will say is that it was larger than McGregor's Drevo's IV extrapolation had suggested, and that it was built for exactly what it had been doing, every part of its structure efficient and purposeful, and that it was clearly the product of a very long evolutionary history of being very good at what it did, and that Hurtado had stopped it with a salvage rifle and 4 rounds and had not flinched. He reloaded without looking at it. He looked at me instead. He said, "Are there more?" And he asked it the way a man asks about a practical problem that has a practical solution, not hopping the answer is no, just needing to know what comes next. McGregor looked at his scanner. He swept the full arc. He swept it again. He stood at the rim of the depression and pointed the scanner down into it and held it there for a full minute. He said no. We waited. The shaft burned steadily from below. The fuel caught on the interior surfaces sustaining the combustion, and we sat on the rocks around the rim and we waited, and nobody said much of anything. Hurtado's people passed a water flask around, and some of them sat, and some of them stood, and all of them watched the scanner in McGregor's hands with the same specific attention. After an hour, McGregor did a complete sweep of the surrounding terrain out to 150 meters in all directions. Nothing. He walked the perimeter of the basin. Nothing. He came back and said, "Clear." The emergency fuel reserve of Vega Seca Colony burned itself out over the course of that hour in the shaft it had been pumped into. And I have thought many times about what that fuel represented, the months of planning and budget and logistics that had gone into stockpiling it, the security it represented to the colonists who knew it was there, and I have never once regretted what it was used for. We drove back in the first gray of dawn. Amanda filed her report from the vehicle, managing the transmission with her spare hand, while she navigated the fringe road with the other. By the time we reached Carrion, the story was on the Frontier Press Collective's network, and the regional office's communications were already stacking up on McGregor's receiver, because the regional office monitors the press networks the same way everyone monitors what they can't stop and doesn't want to publicly acknowledge they're watching. Tenient Bravo was on the main street when we came in. He looked at the convoy of vehicles and the people in them, and the equipment strapped to the beds of the rigs, and he looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You're in serious trouble." I told him that McGregor had secured the specimen. The one Hurtado had stopped, and had begun a formal cataloging process, and that the Commission's Xenobiology Division was going to want that data, and that in my experience the Commission's Xenobiology Division, when it wanted data, was capable of making the question of unauthorized fuel expenditure very small very quickly in comparison to the question of what had been in that creek bed, and how long it had been there, and what the Commission's regional office had been told about it, and when. Bravo thought about that. He made some calls. The Commission's response team arrived 4 days later, not an environmental assessment team, a full xenobiological response unit, 6 specialists with equipment that made our borrowed geology scanner look like a child's toy, 2 Commission investigators with the particular manner of people who are very skilled at finding out what happened in situations where what happened is something the Commission would have preferred not to happen. They took the specimen. They took McGregor's samples and his complete notes. They scanned the creek bed for 36 hours and found no additional subsurface cavities and no additional heat signatures. They classified the incident under a designation they did not share with me. They told me the fuel reserves would be replaced at Commission expense, and that given the circumstances and the documented timeline, no criminal charges would be pursued in connection with the unauthorized use of colonial resources. One of the investigators, a woman named Voss, who had the look of someone who has seen more than she was expecting to see when she took this assignment, told me privately, at the shuttle port, that the Commission's Long-Range Survey Division had been tracking something anomalous in the regional data for 2 years and had not known how to categorize it. She said, "You should know that your report is going to be read by people who don't usually read field reports." I asked her if there were other landing sites, other settlements. She said she couldn't tell me that. I looked at her face while she said it. Her face said, yes. I flew out of Carrion on a clear morning with the settlement spread out below me as the shuttle climbed, the grid of streets and the cluster of buildings and the fields beyond them running south toward the fringe. It looked small from the air, the way all human-built things look small when you get high enough. It also looked exactly like what it was, something people had made and maintained and defended, and intended to go on maintaining and defending for as long as they were capable of it. McGregor published 3 papers in the subsequent years, from the samples he had retained before the Commission took everything else. They were redacted by the time they cleared the academic review process, sections removed, findings qualified into ambiguity, the specific location and settlement name replaced with a geographic code, but they were published, and they were there in the database for anyone who knew how to read what the redactions were pointing at. He told me once, years later, that the thing he found most significant in what he had documented was not the mechanism itself, but the assumption the mechanism contained. These organisms had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated biological tool for defeating fear. Every adaptation they had was oriented around the certainty that the thing they were hunting would become afraid, and would, in becoming afraid, become cooperative with its own death. The lysis cascade worked because the prey stopped fighting. The prey stopped fighting because it was afraid. He said it was a reasonable assumption. He said it had probably worked, for a very long time, on every species these things had ever encountered. Fear is the correct biological response to something large and dangerous and unknown. Fear conserves energy and reduces injury risk and is, from a survival mathematics standpoint, usually the right call. He said most living things respond to an existential threat by trying to become smaller. He said the part that he thought about when he couldn't sleep was the second gear. I think about Hurtado loading his rifle without looking at the thing he had just shot, looking at me instead, asking if there were more. I think about 31 people pushing fuel rigs in the dark in silence. I think about the rancher in the corner of the bar, the tired man with the 2 daughters, who was part of Hurtado's watch group that night, who pushed one of those rigs through the dark and stood at the rim while the shaft burned and walked back to the vehicles afterward without being asked to. He told me, the morning before I left Carrion, that he had not slept properly in 7 weeks, and that since the night in the creek bed, he had slept very well. He said we did something. He said it the way you say something that you need to be true, and that is also, in fact, true, and that you know will remain true in the way that real things remain true, even when no one is saying them. I left Vega Seca and I went back to work, and the commission sealed the records, and the settlement went on. 43,000 people under their slightly off blue sky, farming their red soil ground, building what they had crossed light years to build. They replaced the emergency fuel reserve. They fixed the pasture fences that had come down in the chaos. The livestock came back out of the indoor shelters. The children went back to school and presumably grew up and had children of their own, who grew up knowing nothing specific about what happened in the Southern Creek Basin, except maybe the vague shape of it, the way communities know things they don't discuss directly. I never went back. I didn't need to. What I needed I had already taken with me, which is this, the knowledge that the second gear exists, that there is something in us that is not fear and does not run on fear, and that the things in that creek bed, for all their evolved sophistication, for all the millennia they had spent perfecting the technique of making living things cooperate with their own death, had never encountered it before. They thought they knew what we were. They had never met anything that functions better angry than afraid, that converts grief into precision, that looks at an overwhelming threat and calculates not how to survive it, but how to make certain it cannot do this to anyone else. They made a mistake that their biology had never required them to learn from. We made sure they didn't get a second chance to learn it. The last thing I remember about leaving Vega Seca is the ground from the shuttle window, flat and red and enormous, running south past the colony's edge into the open country that the settlers hadn't built on yet. Empty land. Theirs now, in the way that things become yours when you have paid for them with something real. They paid more than they should have had to, more than was fair. And fairness was never on offer out there on the fringe. They're still there. That's the part that matters, not the fire, not the sound from below, not even Hurtado and his rifle, though I think about Hurtado more than almost anything else. The rancher sleeping soundly. We did something.